At 7:42 a.m. local time in the southern Caribbean Sea, a U.S. Navy carrier strike group was moving steadily through international waters along a pre-planned route. The path had been submitted, reviewed, and legally cleared several days in advance. There were no course changes, no special drills, and no active training events planned. Only controlled, routine movement through one of the busiest maritime regions in the Western Hemisphere. From the outside, the scene looked completely ordinary. But deep inside the ship, in the operations center, the screens were beginning to tell a more complicated story. At 7:44, a radar operator leaned slightly closer to his display. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but the people around him knew what it meant. A new surface contact had appeared near the outer edge of the radar picture. It was faint, inconsistent, and moving more slowly than expected. New surface contact, bearing 170.
There was no panic, no raised voices, no sudden movement. The report was calm, professional, and immediately entered into the system. Within 30 seconds, the image became clearer. And then, it changed again. A second contact appeared. Then a third. 3 surface vessels were now visible, all emerging from roughly the same sector. None of them were transmitting AIS. None answered automatic identification requests. Their radar profiles were sharp, solid, and more consistent with naval-style hulls than ordinary commercial vessels.
Even then, nothing justified an immediate escalation. The Caribbean is filled with maritime traffic every day. Fishing boats, coastal patrol units, merchant vessels, and regional naval ships operating near their own waters. For the moment, the classification stayed neutral, unidentified but not confirmed as a concern. Then the tracking data began to build. The 3 vessels were not wandering. They were not following common commercial routes. Their headings were slightly different, but their projected paths pointed toward the same area. An area that crossed the carrier strike group's expected route within the next 40 minutes. The speed readings updated again. All 3 vessels increased pace within the same 2-minute window. That detail stood out. Separate ships do not usually adjust speed at nearly the same moment, unless they are coordinating. Weather did not explain it. Traffic patterns did not explain it. Fishing activity did not explain it either. Inside the operations center, the watch supervisor moved closer to the console. Mark those tracks. Let's watch the vectors. Long-range optical sensors were directed toward the bearing. At that distance, visual confirmation was still limited, but the outlines were beginning to form. Angular upper structures, low-profile shapes, and silhouettes that did not match civilian craft. The bridge was notified, not warned, simply informed. The officer of the deck acknowledged the update and gave a measured instruction. Maintain course and speed. That order was intentional. In U.S. Navy surface operations, reacting too early can create complications faster than waiting for a clearer picture. The procedure is straightforward. Observe first, classify carefully, and only elevate the response when intent becomes clearer. At 7:49, the system recorded another shift. This was no longer simple coincidence. Still, the crew did not move to an elevated posture. No emergency tones sounded. No aircraft were sent into the air. At this point, the situation existed in that narrow gray zone between chance and coordination. Bridge-to-bridge messages were prepared, but not sent immediately. Protocol required patience. Reading another vessel's intent too early can turn a routine encounter into a diplomatic problem in seconds. Every detail was being recorded. Radar returns, timestamps, speed changes, bearing shifts. Nothing clearly confirmed danger, but nothing looked harmless either. At sea, intent is rarely spoken directly. It is read through movement, timing, spacing, and pattern. And by 7:52, that pattern was becoming harder to dismiss. The 3 vessels continued to close the distance. Their headings now framed the carrier strike group's line of travel. They were not following behind it. They were not simply moving alongside it. They were angling toward its path. Not openly confrontational, not yet, but clearly deliberate. Inside the Combat Information Center, no one used dramatic language. Still, no one called it routine anymore. In naval operations, the moment something stops being routine, is the moment every decision starts to matter. By 7:55 a.m., the surface picture had become stable, but the purpose behind it remained unclear. All three contacts were now firmly tracked on radar. Their returns were sharp and consistent. There were still no commercial transponder signals, no declared routes, and no response to passive maritime identification requests. The tracks held long enough for the system to calculate projections, and those projections told a quiet but unmistakable story. If nothing changed, the closest point of approach would happen in less than 25 minutes. That timeline mattered. Inside the operations center, the range rings tightened across the display. Speed readings updated every few seconds. The three vessels had increased to a steady, purposeful pace, faster than casual coastal patrol movement, but slower than a direct, high-speed approach. It was the kind of speed chosen when someone wants room to react, but not enough room to explain. The watch supervisor spoke evenly. Contacts are adjusting heading again. Minor corrections, all three. That was the moment coincidence effectively disappeared. Independent vessels can cross paths. They can even appear to shadow another ship for a time. But three vessels adjusting course within seconds of one another pointed to coordination. Not openly aggressive, but intentional. The bridge received the update and acknowledged it without further comment. The order stayed the same. Maintain course, maintain speed. This was not hesitation, it was control. From a tactical perspective, changing course too early gives the initiative away. It signals uncertainty. It invites more pressure. The doctrine was clear. The carrier strike group would continue exactly as planned until the other side's intent crossed a defined line. At 7:58, the decision was made to open formal communications. Bridge-to-bridge calls went out across international maritime frequencies. Unidentified naval vessels. This is a United States Navy warship operating in international waters. State your intentions. The message was transmitted clearly and professionally. It was automatically logged. No reply came back. The call was repeated, this time in Spanish. Still nothing. That silence mattered. At sea, a failure to answer is not always accidental. Equipment can fail, of course. But three vessels going silent at the same time is difficult to explain as coincidence. More often, silence is a decision, and decisions at sea carry weight. The contacts continued closing. Range dropped below 50 nautical miles. Then the geometry changed again. The three vessels were no longer approaching from a wide arc. They began narrowing the angle between them, tightening their formation in a way that reduced open movement space and increased positional pressure. This was not standard navigation behavior. Inside the operations center, analysts marked the maneuver for what it resembled. Early-stage blocking geometry. Not a full block, not yet. But the shape was beginning to form. Electronic monitoring teams increased passive observation. The ship's systems listened without transmitting, collecting every radar sweep and stray signal from the approaching vessels. They were watching back. That detail was passed to the bridge. Still, there were no alerts, no raised voices, and no visible rush. The calm was deliberate. In situations that sit between routine contact and open confrontation, discipline is what separates control from chaos. At 8:02, the contacts crossed another line. Not a geographic one, but a behavioral one. All three vessels increased speed again. The change was small, but it happened together. Their headings now framed the carrier strike group's projected route, instead of simply crossing it. This was pressure created through proximity. A close pass, when handled properly, can be legal. But when it is coordinated and left unexplained, it begins to mean something else. The officer of the deck authorized another bridge-to-bridge call. Unidentified vessels, you are maneuvering in an unsafe manner. Alter course to maintain safe separation. The message was logged, recorded, and time-stamped. Again, there was no response. That lack of communication pushed the assessment forward. This was no longer an unclear situation moving toward an answer. It was a coordinated approach, being carried out without acknowledgement and without explanation. In naval operations, that combination limits the number of safe options very quickly. The carrier strike group continued steady, No visible course change, no speed adjustment, no dramatic signal from the outside. But beneath that calm surface, the posture was changing. Sensors were focused, records were building, options were being prepared. Because when three military vessels approach in silence on merging vectors, the question is no longer whether they see you. The question becomes what they plan to do next. At 8:05 a.m., the encounter crossed a threshold that maritime etiquette could no longer explain. The three Venezuelan naval vessels adjusted their formation again, this time with clear purpose. Their headings shifted from converging toward constraining. On the radar display inside the Combat Information Center, the geometry changed shape. What had first appeared to be three separate tracks now formed a shallow arc across the carrier strike group's projected path. Not parallel, not trailing. Ahead, and offset just enough to force a decision. This was no longer just an approach. It was a blocking maneuver. The range closed to under 10 nautical miles. Closest point of approach calculations updated automatically, showing a tighter margin than before.
At that distance, even a small course adjustment could create a chain reaction. Confusion, misreading, collision risk, or a larger incident. The watch supervisor spoke quietly. CPA under 2.5 nautical miles. All contacts maneuvering with intent. That phrase mattered. With intent was not emotional language. It was analytical. It meant the vessels were no longer simply responding to the carrier strike group's movement. They were trying to shape it. On the bridge, the officer of the deck studied the plot. The response remained controlled. Log it. Maintain course and speed. That order carried meaning. Holding course under pressure is not passive. It is a statement of legal right. Changing heading at that moment would not necessarily reduce the risk. It could instead reward the maneuver being attempted. Bridge-to-bridge calls were sent again, firmer this time, but still professional. Venezuelan naval vessels. This is a United States Navy warship.
You are conducting unsafe maneuvers in international waters. Alter course immediately.
The message went out in English, then again in Spanish. Still nothing. At this point, silence was no longer unclear. It was a choice. The three vessels continued closing. Through long-range optics, their wakes became visible, sharp, clean, and lengthening as they moved. Visual identification confirmed military hulls. Crew members were visible topside. Bridge windows were occupied. No deck systems appeared to be actively manned.
That detail mattered, but it did not solve the problem. A blocking maneuver does not need open escalation to be effective. It worked through closeness, pressure, and one simple assumption, that the other side would be the first to give way. Inside the Combat Information Center, the electronic monitoring team began recording stronger signal activity. It was still not a direct guidance signal, it was still not a hard lock, but the search patterns had become more active, sweeping wider areas and refreshing more quickly. The Venezuelan vessels were now clearly tracking the carrier group. That detail was added to the log. At 8:08, the lead Venezuelan ship's projected path brought it within less than 2 nautical miles. That was the danger zone. At that range, small miscalculations can turn into serious incidents. A slight steering error can become a major event. And when military vessels are involved, those moments rarely stay simple for long.
The captain was informed, not urgently called, informed. Moments later, he stepped onto the bridge, reviewed the plot, checked the bearings, and noted the continued silence over the radio. No order was rushed. Instead, the ship's posture changed. Below decks, the forward deck system shifted slightly off centerline, just enough to be noticed by anyone watching through binoculars or long-range optics. It was not presented aggressively. It was not a direct challenge. It was visible by design, a signal, not a provocation.
Electronic systems stayed passive, but fully prepared. Sensors tracked every movement, every formation change, and every small adjustment made by the approaching ships. Above the flight deck, the Seahawk helicopter was moved into launch readiness. Pilots strapped in, sensors warmed. The aircraft was prepared. No launch order yet, only readiness.
This was controlled escalation without crossing the line. The Venezuelan ships held their positions, maintaining the block and reducing the open water ahead. Their movement left little doubt about their purpose, but it still stopped short of an unmistakable direct act. That was the calculation. Apply pressure, avoid the final line, force the other side to respond first. But the carrier group did not take the bait. It continued along its planned route, steady and predictable, refusing to surrender control of its navigation. At 8:10 a.m., the encounter reached its highest point of tension. 3 warships, 1 US carrier group.
International waters. No radio response. No course change.
By then, no one was expecting an explanation. They were waiting for the next move. Because once a block is formed, there are only 2 ways forward. Someone pushes harder, or someone steps back. At 8:12 a.m., the situation was no longer just about distance. It was about control. The 3 Venezuelan warships remained positioned ahead of the carrier group's projected route.
They were close enough to make their message obvious, but careful enough to avoid crossing the final legal boundary that would require an immediate response. It was a calculated test of restraint. The US Navy's answer did not come from a dramatic show of force. It came from procedure. Inside the Combat Information Center, the posture shifted quietly. Electronic monitoring teams moved from routine logging to focused collection. The ship's systems began building a clean record of signals: radar sweeps, timing patterns, pulse intervals, and movement data. Nothing was disrupted. Nothing was hidden. Everything was documented. Long-range optical sensors focused on each vessel one by one. Bridge windows, mast arrays, deck movement, and visible crew activity. Every frame was time-stamped, location-marked, and stored. This was no longer only about awareness. It was about evidence. On the bridge, the captain gave a short order.
Launch the helo. Minutes later, the Seahawk lifted from the flight deck and climbed cleanly into the air before banking low and forward. Its altitude stayed conservative. Its speed remained measured. This was not an aggressive pass. It was presence. Visible, controlled, and fully within procedure. As the helicopter closed the distance, its sensor operator brought the forward-looking infrared system online. Engine heat, bridge activity, and warm compartments appeared clearly on the display.
The feed streamed live back to the ship and appeared inside the Combat Information Center.
The message was simple: we see everything. At 1 nautical mile, the Seahawk leveled off and took position beside the lead Venezuelan vessel. No sharp moves, no sudden turns, just a steady orbit that made its markings impossible to miss. Then the low-power visual designator activated. It was not a warning signal in the dramatic sense. It was closer to a spotlight, controlled, visible, and impossible to ignore. Then the radio came alive. Venezuelan naval vessels, this is a United States Navy helicopter. You are maneuvering unsafely in international waters. Alter course immediately. The transmission was calm, firm, and repeated in Spanish. This time, something changed. Through the Seahawk's optics, movement was visible on the Venezuelan bridge. Figures shifted position. One crew member stepped forward. Another moved away from the windows.
On deck, sailors who had been standing near the forward section began to withdraw.
Moments later, the first measurable change appeared on radar. The lead vessel reduced speed, first by 2 knots, then by another. Its wake shortened visibly, the sharp white line behind it fading as power eased back. The second vessel followed, its heading drifting a few degrees away from the blocking line. The third vessel paused a little longer, but not for long. At 8:16, its speed dropped as well.
The formation that had been tightening around the carrier strike group's route began to open.
The gaps between the vessels widened. The shallow arc ahead broke apart into 3 separate tracks, no longer moving as one. The Seahawk kept its orbit. Sensors remained focused. The visual marker stayed controlled. No taunting, no chase, no unnecessary pressure, only presence. Inside the Combat Information Center, analysts watched the geometry change in real time. The closest point of approach calculations updated again, but now the trend was moving outward. The block was coming apart. Only then did a voice finally answer over the radio. United States naval vessel, we are conducting sovereign patrol operations near Venezuelan waters. It was not an apology. It was not a full explanation, but it was communication. The reply from the bridge came immediately, precise and controlled. This is a United States Navy warship conducting lawful transit in international waters.
Your maneuvers are being recorded. Maintain safe separation. No debate, no argument, no negotiation. The Seahawk completed one final orbit, making sure the course changes continued, then climbed away and returned to the ship. By 8:20 a.m., the Venezuelan vessels were no longer positioned ahead of the carrier strike group. They remained close enough to be seen and tracked, but they were no longer applying direct pressure. No open clash had occurred. No heated exchange had taken place.
Still, the message was clear. The carrier strike group had not changed course. The situation had not spiraled. And the attempted block had failed, not because of a dramatic display, but because of disciplined, recorded control. Sometimes the strongest response is not the loudest one. Sometimes it is the one that leaves behind a complete record. By 8:25 a.m., the encounter was effectively finished. The three Venezuelan vessels were still visible on radar, but their posture had changed entirely. No more converging tracks, no more synchronized speed changes. Their routes now ran parallel and slightly behind the carrier strike group's course. Present, but no longer pressing. The carrier strike group had never deviated. Course steady, speed unchanged, transit uninterrupted. That result was not accidental. It came from discipline, and it exposed the central miscalculation Venezuela had made from the start. The assumption was simple. Restraint meant weakness. But in gray zone naval encounters, that assumption often fails. The Venezuelan vessels had tried to create pressure without crossing into an unmistakable escalation. The logic was familiar. Force a reaction, provoke a course change, create footage, claim a symbolic win. No major line crossed, no official confrontation, just enough friction to test resolve. But that strategy falls apart when the other side refuses to react emotionally. Instead of giving ground, the carrier strike group did something more important. It documented everything. Every course correction, every synchronized speed change, every unanswered hail, every radar emission, every second of blocking geometry. What looked, on the surface, like a brief standoff became something far more valuable underneath. A complete intelligence picture. By choosing proximity over patience, Venezuela gave away data. Their maneuvering habits became visible. Their coordination discipline became visible. Their communication thresholds became visible. Their limits under pressure became visible. And all of it was collected without the situation tipping out of control. That is why the move backfired. In modern naval operations, control is not proven by who moves closest first. It is proven by who owns the record after the encounter ends. Who can show intent? Who can show restraint? Who can show professionalism under pressure? The carrier strike group did more than protect freedom of navigation. It protected legitimacy. When this encounter is reviewed by analysts, planners and diplomats, the record will be difficult to dispute. The carrier strike group was conducting lawful transit. It issued proper warnings. It held a steady course. It used measured, non-lethal steps only when the situation required them. The Venezuelan vessels, on the other hand, maneuvered without communication, applied coordinated pressure, and only backed away once they were met with clear presence, full documentation, and no emotional reaction. That difference matters. In the gray zone, perception becomes leverage. Evidence becomes deterrence. And in this case, Venezuela provided both. As the distance between the ships began to grow, the rhythm aboard the carrier strike group slowly returned to normal. Sensors stayed active, logs were completed, video feeds were archived. There were no celebrations, no speeches, no dramatic commentary. Just routine professionalism taking over again. For the sailors involved, it became another entry in the ship's record. For planners watching from a distance, it confirmed something the US Navy has understood for decades. You do not need to overreact to prevail in these encounters. You need enough patience to let the other side reveal its own intent. The Venezuelan ships had tried to challenge steel with steel. What they met instead was procedure, and procedure is relentless. Because once an attempted block fails, once it is recorded, reviewed and placed in context, it does more than end one tense encounter.
It creates a precedent. It raises the cost of trying the same move again. It forces future commanders to think carefully before repeating that approach under the same conditions. That is the quiet consequence of this standoff. No dramatic impact, no fiery headline, no chaotic scene, just a strategic balance made clearer. As the carrier strike group continued along its planned route, the message was already complete. It did not need to be shouted. It did not need to be broadcast. It had been demonstrated.
In international waters, discipline travels farther than intimidation. And restraint, when backed by capability, clarity and a complete record, is not weakness, it is control. So the question remains for anyone watching these gray zone encounters unfold across the world's oceans. Should restraint remain the strongest tool in situations like this? Or does it only invite the next challenge? Share your take in the comments. Because out here, between silence and escalation, every decision leaves a wake. And some mistakes remain visible long after the ships have turned away.